Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation. This is this week's issue of the Libertarian Angle. I'm joined by my co-host, Richard Ebeling, who teaches economics at the Citadel. And this week we're going to discuss Franklin Roosevelt and his New Deal, how it purportedly saved America's free enterprise system. You know, that's what we're always taught, Richard, in our public schools and our economics classes, that the free enterprise system failed, notwithstanding its vaunted superiority and all the good things it does. It just failed in 1929 with the stock market crash, and that it took Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal to save free enterprise. So I thought we'd talk about and really destroy that myth that every school child in America is inculcated with. I mean, the way I look at it is that Roosevelt's plan, the New Deal that they called it, was just a combination of socialism and fascism. You had here the groundwork for the welfare state revolution in America, where the government takes money from one group of people and gives it to another group of people. And that really was the whole foundation of the Social Security system, which Roosevelt had gotten from Otto von Bismarck of Germany, and he himself had gotten it from the German socialists. In fact, it's kind of ironic that on the Social Security Administration's website, they have a bust to Bismarck, not the founding fathers of America, but to Bismarck. And then you had all these fascist schemes like the AAA and the National Industrial Recovery Act. But the way they were able to sell this, Richard, I mean, let's face it, Roosevelt was a political genius, that all of this are measures to save America's free enterprise system, because you couldn't tell Americans that they were moving towards socialism and fascism. They never would have gone with that. So you just call it free enterprise measures. What do you think?
Well, that is absolutely the truth. The problem is that they tarred and feathered the Hoover administration, which had come to office in January of 1929, the Herbert Hoover administration, just before the stock market crash of October of 29. And then, of course, Hoover presided over the U.S. administration for the first 4 years of the Depression until Roosevelt took office in March of 1933. Presidents used to be inaugurated in March back then instead of January. And they portrayed this well, we have to take a step back here, because I know you know this, but many of the viewers may not know this, is that when Franklin Roosevelt was nominated by the Democratic Party in 1932 to run as their candidate against Herbert Hoover, who was running for re-election, they issued a party platform, as every party does. And if one goes through the Democratic Party platform of 1932, I know this is going to seem like a shocking thought, but even Jacob Hornberger would have voted for it. Yes, viewers, even him. Okay, now what I mean by that,
I really resemble that remark.
Every minute. You have to watch this guy every minute. Okay, that party platform of 1932 called for the following: a reduction in government spending, a balancing the budget, but not through raising taxes, that the federal government was intruding too much into the state-level affairs. In other words, the federal government was not respecting properly and constitutionally states' rights, and the government should reduce its intervention in the private sector. And they called upon a pledge of maintaining and preserving a solid gold standard as a basis of the U.S. currency to prevent any danger of inflation. So perversely and peculiarly, the platform upon which Roosevelt was running was in fact a platform against government intervention, control, restriction, and deficit spending. Now, of course, when he came into office in that March of 1933, and he instituted what he came to call the New Deal, that involved the implementation of policies and programs exactly counter to that, because then he had this brain trust, this group of academics and intellectuals and popular columnists and opinion makers of the time, this brain trust, who actually were made up of a cohort of those who viewed themselves as part of the American progressive movement. And by the progressive movement meant that we had to get beyond the old ways of constitutional government, relying upon the supposed workability of the private enterprise system. And we have to have sort of a socially guided policy of Social Security, unemployment insurance, recognizing the right and power and the legislative privileges that should be given to unions against the evil businessmen who will never give a worker a fair shake. And that was the policy. Now the two elements here is that there were two strands of the progressive movement, of which you talked about socialism and fascism. There were those who were deeply impressed by what they saw as the grand experiment going on in the new Soviet Russia following the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917. Yes, things were rocky, and the Russians seemed a little bit crude around the edges with their sort of repression of civil liberties and violence and people disappearing in the middle of the night. But the fact is that they felt that this was making a new world to overcome capitalist exploitation, inequality of wealth, a fairness, where production would be guided for the people rather than for narrow private interested profit. The other element of this is that while it seems bizarre and peculiar today, in the 1920s and 1930s, there was another radical collectivist ideology that was extremely appealing to American intellectuals, and that was Mussolini's fascism. Mussolini seemed to be offering a third way. Now, what was that third way? Not the unbridled, laissez-faire capitalism of a rugged individualism that was no longer relevant, nor the radical societal upheaval of communism, right? Tearing the society down to make a new socialist world. What Mussolini was saying is that all members of the society have something to contribute to the national interest. And in that sense of contributing, the businessman, the laborer, the professional, the farmer, but their private activities must be harnessed to serve this wider and greater national good. And therefore, Mussolini had this corporativist ideology or philosophy or system of economics in which all businesses would be compelled to join government-mandated cartels. All workers would have to belong to government overseen and controlled unions. Farming was covered this, professions, occupations. And then these corporatist cartels would then, in conjunction with government as the overseer for the national interest, determine prices, wages, work conditions, levels of production, to how much output would be produced, and to whom it would be sold at the government-regulated price. That, in fact, became the ideal for that first generation of New Dealers, whether they called it fascism or not. Because, as you mentioned, what did Roosevelt immediately do within a few months, right, of coming into office? The National Recovery Adjustment Act. This was basically set up, NRA, to impose government-mandated cartels on businesses, and these cartels, with government oversight, would determine production, prices, and output level and distributions of that production. In agriculture was the Agricultural Adjustment Act, as again you also referred to. And that basically mandated what prices farmers could charge, what crops they could grow, what livestock they could raise. And if the crops were the wrong ones or too large, or the livestock was of the wrong types and too large, the crops had to be dug over and the livestock had to be killed. There were imagery of like little piglets while people are starving in America being slaughtered under the Agricultural Adjustment Act. There was also the WPA, the Works Progress Administration, a vast public works project of government in partnership with private businesses to build the infrastructure of America. That was the Tennessee Valley Authority, TVA, the massive dam system in the lower Midwest of the United States. Then there was the Civilian Conservation Corps. This was meant to be a national awakening of the youth of America who were unemployed. And they were drawn in for attractive little gimmicks and incentives to go off into the national park system and live sort of like a military style of cleaning away the underbrush and marching around with shovels instead of guns. And then they had big propaganda rallies, very similar to both the communists and the fascists, as I know you know, Jacob, but I know that a lot of the listeners may not appreciate, the viewers. They had a huge propaganda campaign, just like the Nazis had their rallies and there were the marches in Red Square in Moscow. They would have parades supporting the New Deal throughout the cities of the United States. You can see some of these on YouTube. And there's one parade, I forget where Al Jolson, the famous singer of the 1920s, I'd walk a million miles for one of your smiles, my mommy, Al Jolson. And the reporter sticks a microphone in Al's mouth. And he says, well, Al, what do you think of the New Deal? And Al Jolson says, the New Deal? The New Deal? It's better than my wedding night. And remember, that's when wedding nights used to mean something. So that was a big deal. They had Shirley Temple, who was later a conservative friend of Reagan's, but the little actress, the little girl star. She would be doing little dance routines for shorts that would be shown in movie theaters supporting the New Deal. And so this went on and on. And then also, they didn't have a secret police, but they had an informers network. So all prices are set, all wages are set, and every retail business in the United States was required to have a symbol on its retail store window. It was the symbol of the NRA, and this was the Blue Eagle, with a lightning bolt in one of the feet of the bird, and then like an industrial cog in the other. And the slogan underneath it was, we do our part. That is, we obey the government's imposed price regulations of fair prices. And the citizens are expected to check up on, well, are the prices that the regulated, publicly announced regulated prices, and not you inform on the retailer, and then he is subject to penalty and fine for violating the federal price regulations. So that was the atmosphere of America. At football halftime, right? Football halftimes, instead of the cheerleaders coming on and playing with their little pom-poms, they would have people come on the stage, and from a blimp on high, being from which a camera was attached, they would watch people form the image of the Blue Eagle. Like the image of, like in Moscow, where people would form the hammer and sickle, or in Germany, the swastika, the Blue Eagle. Now, that's all things bizarre today, but this was the era of that first FDR New Deal. Now, that more than anything else, in terms of the economic controls, restrictions, prohibitions, commands, this more than anything else is what prevented any type of real recovery of the U.S. economy through the mid and late 1930s, because of basically straitjacketing America in a fascist-style planned economy after the failures of Herbert Hoover's own interventionist policies that had prevented the rebalancing and correcting of the U.S. economy the few years earlier before that.
Yeah, there's a fantastic book along the lines of what you're talking about called Three New Deals by a guy named Shivelbush.
Yes.
And he talks, I forget the subtitle, but it's Roosevelt's New Deal, Hitler's program, and Mussolini's program, where Shivelbush is comparing the three programs. What was happening in Germany, which was being extolled by a lot of people around the world, Hitler's economic program to bring greatness back to Germany. And then the same thing with Mussolini. In fact, there's that famous letter that Roosevelt sends to that Hitler sends to Roosevelt through diplomatic channels, commending Roosevelt on his New Deal and his economic philosophy, saying that you see things the way we do here in Germany. The greater good shall always reign triumphant over the selfish, greedy aspects of the private entrepreneur, something like that. It's really humorous, but very true.
Actually, if I could just interject that point, I forget whether it was 1934 or 1935, but Newsweek magazine, in one of their issues, did a story about Mussolini with one of their reporters interviewing him. And in that interview, he said that he greatly admires Franklin Roosevelt because he, like himself, is a social fascist.
Yeah. That's at least they could see it. While, Americans then and even now were, saying, oh, well, this is fantastic because he's saving free enterprise. And that thing about the Blue Eagle, it really is. You get the sense of being in what it was like to be in Mussolini's Italy, because they brought this whole idea of patriotism into this thing of what a genuine American should be doing, and then all the pressure.
Yes.
Now what's interesting about this, Richard, is that we saw what happened after 9/11, where the federal government used that as an opportunity to seize emergency power to assassinate, round up Americans, put them into military dungeons, concentration camps. We know that happens when there's that kind of foreign policy crisis. But here in the New Deal, it goes to show you that an economic crisis can be just as dangerous to people's freedom, and this false sense of patriotism and the pressure that they were putting on store owners. You better go along with this program if you know what's good for you. And so there were boycotts of businessmen that said, I'm not going to go along with this fascist nonsense, because there were still many conservatives that were opposing it. They saw it for what it was. And there's that famous photograph where I think it's the head of Sears and Roebuck is being carried out in his chair by federal agents, because I forget what the story is, but he's protesting against the New Deal in some way. Do you remember that?
Yes. There were a handful of people who did that opposition, but the fact is that even if you read the business magazines of the time, and I've gone back and actually looked at these issues to get sort of like a flavor of the times and the period and the attitudes, and Business Week magazine, Fortune, all of these were saying, particularly when Roosevelt began it, we're in this national crisis, an economic downturn, nothing experienced like in living memory. We have to give the new president a chance to see if he can bring this about. And that means that business and labor and farmers and everyone else in the society has to sort of go along with him to see if this is an avenue for real recovery, to escape from what was a terrible depression. There was, by 1932-33, there was about 25% unemployment as measured by the government labor statistics. Industrial production had fallen about 40%. International trade, greatly due to competing protectionist barriers against each country's goods and services, international trade in real terms had decreased by 50% in a matter of less than 4 years. 8,000 banks failed, which means a lot of people's savings. So Roosevelt may have chosen the wrong policies and taken down America a terrible direction that has continued up until the president who currently occupies the White House. But one has to appreciate that because of the severity of the downturn, exacerbated, of course, by Herbert Hoover's interventionist and regulatory and deficit spending policies. But in people's mind, this was a disaster, and in a desperate situation, people are willing to listen to voices who say, "We have nothing to fear but fear itself." My fellow Americans.
Yeah, but the irony, the dark irony of this, and we talked about this last week on the Libertarian Angle, is that it was the government itself that caused the stock market crash. I mean, that was the Federal Reserve that had come into existence in 1913, another new agency that our American ancestors had nothing to do with. So they caused the disaster, and then they used the disaster to say, oh, well, no, we have nothing to do with this. This is the failure of free enterprise. And, oh, by the way, we need to take away your freedoms through this newfangled system of socialism and fascism that we're calling free enterprise, and it's only going to be temporary. Now, let me digress a second again. We've seen this also with respect to these foreign interventions in the Middle East by the warfare state. We see them destroying Iraq, Afghanistan, Yemen, Libya, Syria, regime change operations. And then they cause this huge refugee crisis, and they say, oh, well, that has nothing to do with us. Well, they're one of the main contributing causes because of all their foreign interventionism. Right. Here, back at the New Deal, it's the government causing the Great Depression. Then they act like they're innocent, and they seize upon that to get a system, Richard, that was supposed to be temporary. I mean, the Great Depression ended at the 30s. We're still living. It turned out to be a permanent change. We've got a welfare state. Social Security grew into Medicare and Medicaid. We've got out-of-control spending. We've got debasement of the currency. We don't use gold anymore, as the Constitution requires and as our founding fathers did. I mean, this turned out to be a really big permanent revolution.
Yes, the New Deal is, in terms of actual implemented policy, and then setting the precedents for a continuation on that path, the New Deal is the watershed in American history. One can point to the earlier periods, the progressive movement, that is the intellectual approach and movement for government redistribution of wealth, regulation, managing by experts, and of course the first experiments with that under Woodrow Wilson. It is under Woodrow Wilson that we have Social Security, that we have the income tax, that we have the Federal Reserve System. Absolutely true. But the full implementation of this ideological and philosophical set of ideas, this collectivism for America, it did not fully arrive in a tidal wave of a transformation of American institutions and policies and people's slow shifting in attitudes until the New Deal. It is the turning point of American history in the most explicit and impacting form. It transformed the United States, and it's a transformation from which we have never recovered for the very reasons that you said. Social Security, 1935, has stayed with us. The first workings of some government assistance for health or medical reasons that snowballed into Medicare, Medicaid, and now Obamacare. The notion that it is the right and duty and responsibility to set up an intricate spider's web of regulatory agencies, bureaus, and departments that must oversee, command, restrict, prohibit, and direct virtually every aspect of economic life in our society. The Federal Register, which is the volume that contains all government regulations to which businesses are expected to comply, is over 80,000 pages, and they add thousands of such additional regulations each year. That has certainly accelerated under Obama. He's not the only president. We didn't get to 80,000 pages just because of Obama. He's just merely the accelerated process of one that has been going on for decades. And all of this begins with Franklin Delano Roosevelt and the New Deal. And as I know you also know, Jacob, very well, perhaps maybe some of the viewers have forgotten their history, the only thing that saved us from a permanent fascist economy in the mid-1930s was the courage, the integrity, and the principle of the members of the United States Supreme Court, who unanimously declared, when some cases finally came before them in 1935 and 36, unanimously declared the National Recovery Act, the fascist controls over business, and the Agricultural Adjustment Act, the fascist controls over farming, to be constitutionally null and void. And of course, that drove Franklin Roosevelt mad. He attempted to want to pack the courts. They're old. They have a lot of cases. Let's add members to the Supreme Court, which basically was to dilute the old constitutionalists from having a majority. Even the Democrats in Congress rejected that. That was even too much for them. But then the justices retired, right? They were old. And whom did he put up for nomination? Those who would then be more sympathetic to a more living document interpretation of the Constitution. And that set us on a very bad precedent as well, as I know you well know.
Yeah, I mean, but it reflects that there was resistance. I mean, this was the time when conservatives, or they may have been libertarians, but they were all called conservatives at that time. There was resistance. They were saying this was socialism and fascism that was being brought in the guise of saving free enterprise. And I know that you have a large collection of books in your library of people that were opposing the New Deal. So there were people doing that, and they were among those on the Supreme Court. There was 4 particular judges that were voting consistently to declare this stuff unconstitutional. They were McReynolds, Butler, Van Devanter, and Sutherland. And they were called the 4 horsemen. And but a lot of times it was a 5-4 decision. And there was that swing vote of sometimes the swing vote would go one way and sometimes the other way. But finally, as you point out, Roosevelt's got this court packing scheme. It was a way to change the constitutional structure. He didn't like the fact that the Supreme Court was declaring this stuff unconstitutional, which was really saying socialism and fascism have no part in American life in terms of our governmental structure. And but he had this court packing scheme, but it went down to defeat. He got attacked by people of his own party saying, I mean, what do you think you are, Benito Mussolini or something? Over time, as you point out, one judge, the swing judge, switched votes. They called it the switch in time that saved 9 justices, because Roosevelt was trying to pack it with additional members that would vote his way. But over time, with retirements, he starts packing the court with his cronies. And finally, in 1937, in a famous case called West Coast Hotel versus Parrish, it all came to an end. And the Supreme Court effectively overruled all the cases effectively, not formally, that had declared the New Deal unconstitutional, but really effectively held that never again would they declare any law in violation of the Constitution with respect to economic liberty. So, as you point out, it really was a watershed period. I mean, this was it was a tsunami of public opinion in favor of the idea that government exists to take care of the citizenry, to watch over them, to give them Social Security, to handle their retirement, to handle their health care with Medicare, to handle their drug decisions with drug laws. I mean, it totally transformed the nature of American society. And ironically, Roosevelt ends up also ushering in, with his machinations in World War II, the whole national security establishment, the warfare state. So he really is a monumental figure for the negative in American history, Richard.
Yes, absolutely. I should just mention that in my book, Monetary Central Planning in the State, which is going to be released very shortly as an ebook by the Future Freedom Foundation, I have 2 chapters in there. One is called FDR and the New Deal, in which I summarize in relative detail in a chapter the very things that we have been discussing today in terms of what Roosevelt did and how and its impact. But I then have a chapter following that in the book called The New Deal and Its Early Critics, in which, as you were saying, there were people who opposed this on sound, free market, constitutional grounds. And in that chapter, I enumerate and explain and summarize not just who they were, but their arguments that they were making already in the 1930s about the danger and undesirability of the direction that Franklin Roosevelt was taking us. So those viewers who might be interested in that, I do summarize both of those aspects of the 1930s, Roosevelt's New Deal and his critics, in those 2 chapters in Monetary Central Planning in the State.
Yeah, and we're coming up with with that publication of that ebook. We're pretty excited about it as part of our new ebook series. Probably in the next 10 days, 14 days, that book. But, Richard, since then, let's face it, conservatives at some point threw in the towel. I mean, they accepted the premises of the welfare state, of the regulated society, of Social Security, of Medicare and Medicaid. And that's why, fundamentally, I don't see any difference philosophically between conservatives and liberals. They're Democrats and Republicans. They're really fighting over who's going to manage the welfare state and the warfare state. It's really us libertarians. They're maintaining that banner of what America was supposed to be founded on, that idea of economic liberty. You keep everything you earn. You handle your own retirement, your own health care. We once had the best health care system in the world. It's just been ruined. And it's those of us in the libertarian movement that are saying, let's restore these certain principles where you keep everything you earn, where there is no central bank, where you have a free market monetary system, where charity, there's a separation of charity in the state. Charity is entirely voluntary. I mean, to me, we're the only hope at this point, because I think things are getting worse and worse and will continue to do so for a long time on the trajectory that was set back in the 1930s by Franklin Roosevelt.
Yes. As the 1940s became the 1950s and the 1950s became the 1960s and then on, it would be unfair to say, of course, all conservatives, but a growing number of conservatives concluded that certain changes that had begun with Franklin Roosevelt and had been solidified and extended with for example, LBJ's Great Society programs of the 1960s, that this was irreversible, that this is now the condition and circumstance of America. We have to live with this. And therefore, all we're concerned about is doing damage control and trying, as conservatives elected to office, manage the interventionist welfare state along more business-like lines, to see that if it's going to be run, let it run efficiently and in a cost-effective manner, and as best we can restrain the speed with which it continues to grow. Notice that, the speed with which it continues to grow. There's no presumption that it can be reversed. Not one candidate on the Republican side who has thrown their hat into the ring. We've been seeing these debates on television now, 2 of them. Not one of them have said, I believe in constitutional government. And constitutional government means, for me, these are the limited and enumerated functions of the federal government under the United States Constitution. And any current activities, programs, departments, bureaus, agencies, regulations, and redistributions that are not explicitly justified and provable under the original Constitution should be considered open to repeal and abolition, and that will be the steps that I will begin if I'm elected to the White House. No candidate on the Republican side has said this and is willing to say this because they have given up the ghost. But unless we have people, first at the level of we're just trying to influence ideas, and then finally in the political arena, until that point, there is no hope for a path that is towards real regaining of freedom in the United States.
No, except for the fact that as you and I have talked about in previous issues of this show, is that obviously the statists were successful in achieving this monumental revolution just through the power of ideas. They were bad ideas, but they brought about, I mean, let's face it, as I pointed out before, in 1890, there was no Social Security, no welfare state, no Medicare, Medicaid, income tax, IRS, Federal Reserve, drug laws and all, warfare state, Pentagon, CIA, NSA. And yet within a relatively short period of time, 30, 40 years, the statists had prevailed in this tsunami of that brought about this welfare, warfare state revolution. There's absolutely no reason why we libertarians can't do the same thing in reverse. And we have this heritage to build on. And let's face it, this movement's growing. A lot of young people are joining up that they've broken through the indoctrination. They see the truth and they're saying, we're libertarians, and they're self-identifying as libertarians. Well, that provides a lot of hope for me. I mean, if you can change it, you can move it in the bad direction, you can move it in the good direction too.
I agree. And if you compare now with, let's say, 30 or 40 years ago, for example, when I was 3 years old, and I met you already as an elder statesman, Jacob.
Thank you.
Decades ago, a young little whippersnapper at Hornberger's knee.
Yeah, in your dream.
I can't resist. Anyway, but the point is, if you go back to 40 years ago, when both of us were much younger lads and met, the fact, 30 years ago, the fact is that at that time, there were hardly any free market, classical liberal, libertarian ideas or organizations of note. There was the Foundation for Economic Education, there was the Freeman, there was Human Events, there was the Conservative National Review. There was only the starting in the 1970s of things like Cato and the Heritage Foundation. It was a wasteland for the ideas of liberty. And whether you view every organization to be more consistently free market or so or not, the fact remains that the movement has made transforming directions that gives us hope that there's a potential change in the climate of opinion.
Absolutely. And when we were in our 20s, and I've pointed this out before, the seniors at that time, people in their 60s and 70s, were saying, man, the future is with you young people, and right. You guys are going to achieve the free society. And that's why it's kind of ironic that, okay, now we're the seniors, and now you got people in our age group saying the future lies with the young people, sort of implying that we can't do it. It's just too difficult. The job is too big. So we have to wait 40 more years. That's why we have to invest in the young. Well, I don't want to wait 40 years. I figure there was a lot of people that invested in our generation 30 years ago. And I say we redouble our efforts to achieve it. We are now in their long run. They used to say, in the long run, we'll achieve freedom. Well, we're there. We're in the long run of the people that were talking to us 30 years ago. And so yes. I love investing in young people, but as a vehicle for achieving freedom in the near term. And I think we can achieve it just like people achieved the welfare warfare state in the 30s and 40s. We just got to redouble our effort and stick with our principles.
Absolutely. Because we have something going for us that they don't. The ideal of the dignity and sanctity and respect for the individual human being to have a right to live his life as he chooses, guided by his own sense of right, wrong, good, bad, as long as he acts peacefully with his fellow human beings in the arena of free society.
On that note, we'll wrap things up. Our time's up for the week. Greatly enjoyed the visit, Richard. This is this week's issue of the Libertarian Angle. We'll be back with you next week.